My name is Robert Whitmore, and the moment I realized my own son no longer saw me as family came on a cold Tuesday evening in early December. Outside my kitchen window, Christmas lights blinked across the neighborhood in that familiar rhythm: red, green, white, red, green, white. My neighbor Bernard had decorated his house the weekend after Thanksgiving, just like he always did. Every year, my late wife Pauline used to joke that he treated Christmas like a military operation. And every year my late wife Pauline used to joke that he treated Christmas like a military operation. 6 years after losing her, I still heard her voice in moments like that. I was standing at the kitchen counter with a cup of coffee when my phone vibrated. The message came from my son, Nathan. At first, I smiled. We had not spoken much that week, and I assumed it was something about the grandchildren. Maybe Elliot's school concert, maybe Sophie wanted another drawing set. Instead, I opened the message and felt something inside me quietly crack. Dad, we talked it over and think it is better if this year you celebrate Christmas on your own. We need space as a family. Diane and I have decided we are doing the holidays with just the kids. We hope you understand. I stared at the screen for a long time. Long enough for my coffee to go cold. Long enough to read the message 4 times and still wonder if I was somehow misunderstanding it. I was not. Nathan and Diane had decided there was not room for me at Christmas. The strange thing was that my first feeling was not anger. It was embarrassment. The kind that arrives when you suddenly realize you have been standing in the wrong place for years and everyone else noticed before you did. I set my phone face down on the counter and walked to the dining room table. That is where the numbers started. I have always trusted numbers. Numbers do not lie. Feelings do. Memories do. Pride certainly does. But numbers tell the truth whether you want to hear it or not. I grabbed a legal pad and began writing. Mortgage payment $2,900 a month. The house Nathan and Diane lived in was technically mine because Nathan could not qualify when they wanted it 3 years earlier. Car payment number 1, $680. Car payment number 2, $520. Insurance coverage, private school tuition for Elliot, household emergency card Diane carried in her purse, one expense after another. I added everything twice because I thought I must have made a mistake. I had not. The total sat there on the paper in black ink, more than $7,500 every month, nearly $90,000 every year. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the number. $90,000 a year to be told I needed to spend Christmas somewhere else. Suddenly, memories began connecting themselves in ways they never had before. The birthday parties I paid for. The vacations I partially funded. The Christmas gifts listed under Nathan and Diane's names that I quietly purchased myself. The endless little emergencies that somehow always ended with my credit card. I had spent years telling myself I was helping because family helps family, but sitting there at that table, I finally asked a question I had avoided for a very long time. If I stopped paying, what would happen? The answer frightened me. Not because of what it would do to Nathan. Because of what it would reveal about our relationship. I looked back toward my phone. The message remained on the screen. We need space as a family. The words echoed in my head. Space. After everything I had done, I had somehow become the outsider. I picked up my phone again, opened my banking application, and stared at the automatic mortgage payment scheduled for the 15th. My thumb hovered over the screen. For several seconds, I thought about Pauline. Then I thought about spending Christmas alone while paying for the table I was not welcome to sit at. Slowly, I pressed the payment details and opened the cancellation menu. And for the first time in years, I seriously considered what life might look like if I stopped funding my son's entire world. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. For the first few seconds, everything felt normal. Then I remembered the message. Christmas on your own. We need space as a family. The words settled over me like a heavy blanket. I made breakfast, fed the birds outside my kitchen window, and tried convincing myself to wait a few days before doing anything. That lasted until I opened my banking app again. The mortgage payment sat there exactly where I had left it the night before. $2,900 scheduled for the 15th. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Then I pressed cancel. A confirmation window appeared asking if I was sure. I pressed yes. Nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no sense of victory, just a small notification confirming the transfer had been removed. Then I moved to the next payment. Nathan's truck, $680. Cancelled. Diane's SUV, $520. Cancelled. One after another, the obligations disappeared from my screen. Looking at them individually, each payment seemed manageable. Looking at all of them together, they felt like evidence. Evidence of a life I had been financing without ever questioning where the line should have been. The insurance policy took longer. Nathan had remained on my plan after losing his job during the pandemic. At the time, it made perfect sense. Families help each other through difficult moments. The problem was that difficult moments have a way of becoming permanent if nobody ever says they are over. I began the process of removing him. Then I turned my attention to the supplementary credit card Diane carried. Officially, it was for emergencies. In practice, emergency had become a very flexible definition. 3 days earlier, the card had been used for $340 at a home decor store and another $67 at a restaurant. Neither seemed particularly urgent. I called the number on the back of my card. The representative asked a series of security questions. 5 minutes later, the card was disabled. A replacement would be mailed directly to me. That left one final payment. Elliot's school tuition, $1,400 every month. I sat with that one much longer than the others. Elliot was 7 years old. He did not send the text message. He did not decide I should spend Christmas alone. He was not responsible for any of this. More importantly, he had no power to change it. I thought about the way he ran toward me every time I attended one of his soccer games. I thought about the science project we built together the previous spring. I thought about Pauline. In the end, I left the tuition alone, at least for now. When I finished, I leaned back in my chair and looked around the kitchen. For years, I had convinced myself these payments were acts of generosity. Maybe they started that way. Somewhere along the line, they became something else. They became a substitute for conversations Nathan and I never had. It was easier to pay a bill than ask why he only called when he needed something. Easier to write a check than admit. I felt myself becoming less important in his life every year. Pauline would have seen it sooner. She always saw things sooner. I did not feel powerful that morning. I did not feel vindicated. Mostly I felt sad. Sad for what our relationship had become and sad for how long I had participated in it without admitting the truth. Around noon, I called my attorney, Gene. He had handled my estate planning for years and knew nearly as much about my finances as I did. I told him I wanted to review several documents. Then I mentioned the house Nathan and Diane were living in. Gene became very quiet. "What exactly would you like to discuss?" he asked. I looked out the window toward the Christmas decorations across the street. "I think it is time we talk about selling it," I said. There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then Gene replied with a sentence that would change everything. "In that case, Robert, we should discuss your options immediately." Gene called me back the following morning. By then, I had spent nearly 24 hours expecting to feel guilty. Instead, I felt strangely calm. Not happy, not relieved, just calm. It was the kind of feeling that arrives when you finally stopped arguing with yourself. For years, every financial decision involving Nathan came with an internal debate. Should I help? Should I say no? Am I being supportive enough? This time, there was no debate. The message he sent had settled something that had been unresolved for a very long time. Gene asked me to come into his office that afternoon. When I arrived, he already had several folders spread across the conference table. Gene was a practical man. One of the reasons I trusted him was that he never wasted energy on drama. He focused on facts. Facts, unlike emotions, were easier to organize. "Let us start with the house," he said. I nodded. The house had been purchased in 2021 when interest rates were still manageable. Nathan and Diane desperately wanted it. Unfortunately, the bank was less enthusiastic. Nathan's credit history was not strong enough, and Diane's income alone could not bridge the gap. I stepped in. At the time, it seemed temporary. A few years of support until they got established. 4 years later, nothing about it looked temporary anymore. Gene slid the property documents toward me. My name sat alone on both the deed and mortgage paperwork. No co-owners, no shared title, no legal ambiguity, just me. From a legal standpoint, Gene said, "This is straightforward." I already knew what he meant, but I wanted to hear him say it. Straightforward how the property belongs to you. The words landed heavily, not because they were surprising, because I suddenly realized how rarely anyone in the family acknowledged them. Over the years, conversations shifted. Nathan spoke about renovations he wanted to make. Diane referred to the place as our forever home. Friends congratulated them on the house. Somewhere along the way, everyone started acting as though ownership and occupancy were the same thing. They are not. Gene continued reviewing options, rental agreements, sale procedures, notice requirements, market conditions. The current housing market remained strong enough that selling would likely happen quickly. Then he asked a simple question. "What outcome are you actually looking for?" I thought about it carefully. The answer mattered. "I am not trying to punish my son." Gene nodded. "Then what are you trying to do?" I stared out the office window for several seconds before answering. "I am trying to stop pretending." That was the truth. For years, I pretended the arrangement was healthy. I pretended generosity and dependency were the same thing. I pretended gratitude would eventually appear if I just waited long enough. None of those things happened. Gene listened quietly. Then he recommended sending formal notice. Not because we needed conflict, because clarity matters. Ambiguity had created enough problems already. By the end of the meeting, The paperwork was ready. A formal legal notice informing Nathan and Diane that I intended to sell the property and that they would need to make alternative housing arrangements. 60 days, more than required, more than most people would have offered, but enough to be fair. I signed the documents. My signature looked steady. That surprised me. Jean arranged for certified delivery. The letter went out Thursday afternoon. Then I waited. Friday morning at exactly 7:52, my phone rang. Nathan. I looked at the screen while sitting at my kitchen table eating breakfast. For a moment, I considered answering. Then I remembered how long it had taken him to answer me when he wanted space. The phone stopped ringing. A few minutes later it rang again, then again. By mid-morning the calls were coming from multiple directions. Nathan, Diane, unknown numbers, text messages, voicemails, questions, panic, confusion. For the first time in years, the flow of urgency had reversed. They needed something from me, and judging by the speed of those calls, they had finally realized exactly how much of their lives rested on decisions they never bothered to appreciate. By lunchtime, my phone showed 14 missed calls. Then a new message appeared from Nathan. Dad, we got the lawyer's letter. Please call me. We need to talk. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Because for the first time since receiving that Christmas message, it sounded like my son had finally understood that something was very, very wrong. The weekend that followed was one of the strangest weekends of my life. For years, I had been the person making the calls, the person checking in, the person solving problems, the person making sure everyone else was comfortable. Suddenly, the roles had reversed. By Saturday morning, my phone looked like a crisis center. Nathan had called 12 times. Diane had called 9. 3 different numbers I did not recognize had also tried reaching me. The voicemail started arriving shortly afterward. The first few sounded confused. Nathan insisted there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. Diane claimed they never expected me to react this way. By Saturday afternoon, confusion had transformed into frustration. The messages became sharper, more emotional, more desperate. I listened to every one of them, but returned none of the calls. Not because I wanted revenge, because for the first time, I needed silence more than I needed another argument. Around 3 o'clock that afternoon, a new voicemail arrived. This time, it was not Nathan or Diane. It was Diane's mother, Carol. I had met Carol dozens of times over the years. She was the kind of person who believed confidence and correctness were the same thing. Robert, she said, her voice already carrying judgment. I think you are making a terrible mistake. Family does not treat each other this way. You need to think about what you are doing to those children. I almost laughed when I heard it. Not because children were involved. Because nobody seemed interested in discussing what had happened before the lawyer's letter arrived. Apparently, excluding an old man from Christmas was not family mistreatment, but expecting adults to pay their own mortgage somehow was. Sunday brought more of the same. Nathan called, Diane called, Carol called again. Then several mutual friends reached out. Some were genuinely concerned. Others clearly knew only one side of the story. The pattern never changed. Everyone wanted to discuss my reaction. Nobody wanted to discuss the reason for it. Late Sunday afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Pauline was buried. It was not something I did every week anymore, but whenever life became complicated, I found myself returning there. I brought fresh flowers and sat on the small bench beside her headstone. The winter air felt cold but peaceful. For nearly an hour, I talked out loud as if she were sitting beside me. I told her about Nathan's message, about the mortgage, about the phone calls, about the house. Most importantly, I admitted something I should have admitted years earlier. I think I helped create this, I said quietly. The realization had been growing ever since that Tuesday night. Nathan was not solely responsible for our relationship becoming transactional. Every time I used money to avoid difficult conversations, I contributed. Every time I solved a problem, instead of demanding accountability, I contributed. Love was not the problem. The way I expressed it sometimes was. As I sat there, my phone buzzed again. Nathan. I watched it ring until it stopped, then another message arrived almost immediately. Unlike the others, this one was short. Very short. Dad, please just talk to me. For the first time all weekend, I felt something shift. Not enough to change my decision, not enough to erase what happened, but enough to recognize something important. Panic was beginning to fade. Reality was starting to replace it. Later that evening, I returned home and listened to Nathan's newest voicemail. His voice sounded different, less angry, less defensive, more tired. I know you are upset, he said. I know I messed up, but if you do not call me back, this situation is going to get worse. I sat alone in my living room after the message ended. Christmas music played softly from a neighbor's house across the street. For several minutes, I stared at my phone. Eventually, I picked it up and opened Nathan's contact information. The time for silence was ending. If anything meaningful was going to happen next, It would require a conversation neither of us had been willing to have for years. And for the first time since receiving that Christmas text, I decided I was finally ready to hear what my son had to say. I called Nathan the following morning, not because I had changed my mind, not because the missed calls wore me down. I called because avoiding the conversation any longer would only delay what needed to happen. He answered before the first ring finished. "Dad." His voice sounded exhausted. I imagined he had not slept much. The truth was neither had I. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Nathan broke the silence. "Thank you for calling." I looked out the kitchen window toward the frost covering the grass. "Before we discuss the house, I want to ask you something." "Okay." My grip tightened slightly around the phone. "Where exactly did you expect me to spend Christmas?" Silence. Not the kind caused by a bad connection. The kind caused by a question someone does not want to answer. Eventually, he spoke. "Dad, no, answer the question." Another pause followed. "I do not know." The honesty surprised me. Not because it was impressive. Because it was rare. "You do not know?" I asked. "No." His voice lowered. I did not really think about it. There it was, the truth hiding beneath everything else. He had not wanted to hurt me. He simply had not thought about me at all. Somehow that felt worse. "Nathan, do you know what bothered me most about your message?" "What?" It was not being excluded. I stared at the family photographs hanging on the wall. Pictures of birthdays, vacations, school graduations, years of memories. It was realizing how easy it was for you. The line went quiet again. I continued before he could interrupt. "You asked me to spend Christmas alone while I was paying for the house you live in, the vehicles you drive, the insurance you use, and half the life you have built. Dad, that is not fair." I almost laughed. Not because the statement was ridiculous, because it revealed how differently we viewed the situation. "What is unfair?" I asked. "We never forced you to help us." "No, I volunteered." "Exactly, and then you started treating that help like it was permanent." The silence returned. This time it lasted longer. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice sounded less defensive. "I did not realize you felt that way. That is part of the problem." I leaned back in my chair. "You did not realize a lot of things." For nearly 20 minutes, we talked. Really talked. Not about interest rates or legal notices or housing markets. About us, about the years after Pauline died, about how often our conversations revolved around money, about how every request for help slowly replaced actual connection. Nathan admitted he had become accustomed to my support. I admitted I had made it too easy. Neither confession felt particularly comfortable. Then we finally reached the subject he wanted to discuss. "Are you really selling the house?" he asked quietly. "Yes." The answer came immediately. No hesitation, no uncertainty, just truth. "Why?" I took a slow breath. "Because the current arrangement is not healthy for either of us. The kids live here. I know they will have to move." "I know that too." Another long silence settled between us. Then Nathan asked the question I knew was coming. "Can you reconsider?" I closed my eyes. For years, that question would have worked. One expression of concern, one emotional appeal, one promise that things would be different. This time was different. "No." The words sounded calm, final, not angry, not cruel, just firm. Nathan exhaled heavily. I could practically hear disappointment settling over him. "So that is it?" he asked. "You are giving us 60 days and that is it?" I looked at Pauline's photograph sitting on the bookshelf across the room. "I am giving you 60 days because I love you." The line went quiet. "But I am selling the house because I finally respect myself." Neither of us spoke for several seconds after that. Then, for the first time during the entire conversation, Nathan stopped arguing. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded very different, smaller somehow. "I think I understand why you are doing this." I was not sure he fully did. Not yet. But it was the first sign that he might eventually get there. And as the call ended, I had a feeling the hardest part of this story was still ahead of both of us. The days following my conversation with Nathan were quieter than I expected, at least on the surface. The phone calls became less frequent. The angry voicemails stopped. Even Carol seemed to lose interest in lecturing me about family values once she realized I was not changing my mind. But silence can be deceptive. Sometimes it means people are thinking, sometimes it means they are planning, and sometimes it means reality has finally arrived. By the second week, the consequences of my decision were beginning to reach Nathan's household. The mortgage payment had not been made, the disabled credit card had stopped working. Insurance paperwork was arriving in the mail. Problems that once disappeared automatically now remained exactly where they landed. One afternoon, I was buying groceries when I ran into Bernard. He immediately noticed something was bothering me. "Still thinking about your son?" he asked. I smiled weakly. Bernard knew me too well. We loaded groceries into my car while talking about everything except Nathan. Football, weather, holiday decorations, retirement. The kinds of conversations men have when they want to discuss a problem without actually discussing it. Eventually, Bernard closed his trunk and looked directly at me. You know what your problem is? I laughed. Only one? You have spent so many years rescuing people that you think standing still is the same thing as abandoning them. The comment followed me all the way home. That evening, I sat in my living room staring at Pauline's photograph. Bernard was not entirely wrong. Every time Nathan faced a financial problem, I solved it. Every unexpected expense became my expense. Every emergency became my responsibility. Somewhere along the way, I stopped asking whether my help was actually helping. Around that same time, new information started reaching me through people who knew both Nathan and Diane. Nothing dramatic, just small details. They had begun looking at apartments. Nathan was asking questions about refinancing options. Diane had apparently contacted several family members seeking temporary assistance. For the first time in years, they were trying to solve problems themselves. The realization brought mixed emotions. Part of me felt relieved. Another part felt guilty. Parenthood has a strange way of making guilt survive long after logic has left the room. A few days later, Elliot called unexpectedly. Hearing his voice immediately brightened my mood. We talked about school, soccer practice, and a science project involving volcanoes. Not once did he mention the house. Not once did he mention lawyers or moving. He was still a child living inside a situation created by adults. Before hanging up, he asked a simple question. Grandpa, are you still coming to my game next Saturday? My throat tightened slightly. Of course I am. Good, he said. You never miss them. After the call ended, I sat quietly for several minutes. That was the relationship I wanted to protect. Not dependency, not financial arrangements, relationships, real ones. Then Saturday arrived. Elliot's team won by 2 points. I stayed afterward to congratulate him and watched him celebrate with his friends. Nathan was there too. We exchanged a brief nod, but little else. Neither of us seemed ready for a public conversation. As I drove home later that afternoon, I felt strangely hopeful. Not because things were fixed, because they were finally becoming honest. The sun had already started setting when I pulled into my driveway. At first, I did not notice anything unusual. Then I saw a familiar pickup truck parked along the curb, Nathan's truck. My stomach tightened immediately. He was sitting alone on the front porch. No Diane, no children, no lawyers, just Nathan. The moment he saw me step out of the car, he stood up. His face looked older than it had a few weeks earlier, more tired, more thoughtful. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then he took a slow breath and said something I never expected to hear. Dad, I think it is time I tell you the truth. I unlocked the front door and invited Nathan inside. The house felt unusually quiet, maybe because Pauline had been gone for 6 years. Maybe because I already knew this conversation had been waiting to happen for much longer than either of us wanted to admit. Nathan followed me into the kitchen and sat at the same table where I had calculated every dollar I spent supporting his family. For a few moments, neither of us spoke. Then he looked down at his hands and exhaled slowly. I owe you the truth. I sat across from him and waited. For once, I was not interested in rescuing him from an uncomfortable moment. Nathan nodded toward the window. When Mom died, everything changed. I remained silent. I know it changed for you too. But after the funeral, I felt like I was suddenly responsible for everything. Diane, the kids, the house we wanted, the life I thought I was supposed to build. His voice sounded tired. Not defensive, just tired. At first, your help felt temporary. I nodded. That was true. It had been temporary. Or at least it was supposed to be. Then it became normal. There it was. The sentence neither of us had said out loud for years. Nathan rubbed his forehead. Every time something went wrong, you fixed it. Every time money got tight, somehow the problem disappeared. I looked at him carefully and eventually you stopped seeing it as help. He gave a small embarrassed smile. Yeah, the honesty hurt, but it also felt strangely relieving. For the first time, neither of us was pretending. Nathan stared at the table for several seconds before speaking again. Diane did not create this situation. That surprised me. I had expected him to blame her. Many people would have. She definitely made it worse sometimes, he admitted. But the truth is, I let it happen. I stayed quiet. It was easier to think of the house as ours, easier to think of the bills as handled, easier to believe the support would always be there. He laughed bitterly. It is amazing how quickly people start calling something normal when they never had to earn it. I noticed something different about him. The arrogance that usually appeared whenever finances came up was gone. In its place stood something far more uncomfortable. Self-awareness. Nathan looked toward Pauline's photograph sitting on the shelf nearby. You know what makes me feel the worst? He asked. I shook my head. That Christmas text was not even meant to be cruel. The answer hit me harder than I expected. What do you mean? I was not trying to hurt you, He swallowed. I just was not thinking about you at all. The room fell silent because deep down we both knew that was the real problem. Cruelty at least acknowledges someone's existence. Indifference does not. Nathan leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. After the lawyer's letter arrived, I spent 3 days being angry. He laughed quietly. I blamed you. I blamed Diane. I blamed the economy. I blamed everyone. Then his expression changed. And then Elliot asked me why Grandpa was not coming for Christmas. My chest tightened. Nathan continued. I told him we wanted family time. He paused. And he said, but Grandpa is family. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Sometimes wisdom arrives from places we least expect. Nathan looked down again. That was the moment it finally hit me. His voice cracked slightly. My son understood something I did not. The kitchen felt very small suddenly. Nathan wiped his eyes and continued, Mom would be ashamed of how I handled this. Hearing Pauline mentioned out loud almost broke me. Not because I disagreed, because I knew she would have seen the problem years earlier. Nathan nodded slowly toward her photograph. She spent her whole life teaching me that relationships mattered more than money. He laughed sadly, then I somehow turned your support into an entitlement program. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at me. No excuses, no arguments, no negotiations, just honesty. Dad, I am sorry. The words sounded simple, but they carried years of unspoken things behind them. I studied my son's face. He looked older than he had a month earlier. Not physically, emotionally, like someone who had finally stopped running from a truth he did not want to face. I was not ready to forgive everything. Some wounds need time. Some trust has to be rebuilt slowly. But for the first time since that Christmas message arrived, I could see a path forward. Then Nathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He placed it carefully on the table between us. There is one more thing you need to see, he said quietly. And judging by the expression on his face, whatever was written on that page was about to change everything again. Nathan slowly pushed the folded paper across the table. For a moment, neither of us touched it. Then I unfolded it and immediately recognized the handwriting. Pauline's. My heart skipped a beat. The letter was dated 8 months before her death. It was not a formal document, just a personal note she had written after updating several family records. I carefully read the first few lines. If you are reading this, it probably means the two people I love most are struggling to understand each other again. I had to stop for a second. That sounded exactly like Pauline. Even after all these years, she somehow knew us better than we knew ourselves. Nathan explained that he found the letter a few days earlier inside one of Pauline's old memory boxes stored in the attic. Neither of us had seen it before. The note was not long, but every sentence felt painfully relevant. Pauline wrote about love and responsibility, about the danger of confusing support with dependence, about how parents sometimes keep giving because they are afraid of losing connection with their children. She also wrote about how children sometimes accept help for so long that they stop recognizing the sacrifices behind it. By the time I finished reading, the kitchen was completely silent. Nathan looked exhausted. I think she saw this coming before either of us did. I nodded slowly. That sounded like Pauline too. She had always noticed small cracks before they became major problems. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Nathan finally asked the question that had been hanging over the entire conversation. Are you still selling the house? The answer hurt both of us. Yes. He closed his eyes briefly, but did not argue. That alone showed how much he had changed. A month earlier, he would have fought the decision. He would have listed reasons, excuses, and financial concerns. Now, he simply nodded. I figured you would. Over the next several weeks, reality moved quickly. The house was listed. Showings began almost immediately. The market was stronger than expected, and within a short period, serious buyers started appearing. Nathan and Diane searched for alternatives. For the first time in their marriage, every housing option had to fit within their actual budget rather than the budget I had quietly supplied. The adjustment was not easy. Apartments seemed smaller. Mortgage options looked less attractive. Financial decisions suddenly carried consequences. Through mutual friends, I heard that Diane was struggling with the changes. Part of her still believed I would reverse course at the last minute. I did not. Not because I wanted to punish anyone, because changing my mind would destroy everything Nathan had finally begun to understand. One Saturday afternoon, I attended another one of Elliot's soccer games. Afterward, he sat beside me on the bleachers while the other children ran around the field. Dad says we are moving, he said. Children have a way of discussing major life events with surprising simplicity. That is true, I replied. Are you sad? I considered the question carefully. A little. Elliot nodded as if that answer made perfect sense. Me too. Then he smiled. But Dad says we will be okay. Hearing those words felt important. Not because they guaranteed success, because Nathan was finally taking ownership of his own future. A few weeks later, the house officially sold. The closing papers were signed. The funds transferred. An important chapter of our family's life ended. That evening, Nathan called me. His voice sounded different than it had months earlier, stronger, somehow, more grounded. "We found a place," he said. "It is smaller, but it is ours." I smiled quietly. There was pride in his voice. Real pride, the kind that comes from earning something instead of inheriting it. As the conversation ended, I looked toward Pauline's photograph and thought about the letter Nathan found in the attic. Maybe she had been right all along. Sometimes love means helping, and sometimes love means stepping back far enough for someone to learn how strong they can become on their own. What neither Nathan nor I realized yet was that the biggest changes were still waiting ahead of us. Winter gradually gave way to spring, and for the first time in years, my relationship with Nathan no longer revolved around money. The change did not happen overnight. It happened through dozens of small moments that would have seemed unremarkable to anyone else. Nathan stopped calling when something broke. He stopped calling when a bill arrived. He stopped calling whenever life became inconvenient. Instead, he started solving problems himself. The first time I noticed it, he was telling me about a plumbing issue in the apartment he had rented after moving out of the house. Months earlier, I would have received a phone call asking for advice, money, or both. This time, he simply laughed and told me how many online videos he had watched before fixing it himself. The story was not particularly exciting, but I remember smiling the entire time he told it because for the first time, he sounded proud of something he had accomplished without my help. Financially, life remained tighter for Nathan and Diane than it had been before. Vacations became less frequent. Spending became more intentional. Expensive purchases required planning instead of assumptions. Yet, something interesting happened. The world did not end. The children adapted. The family adapted. Even Diane seemed to slowly accept a reality she had spent years avoiding. Through occasional conversations, I learned that she had returned to part-time consulting work. Nathan picked up additional responsibilities at his company. Together, they built a budget, an actual budget, not one supported by invisible contributions from me, but one supported by their own efforts. One Saturday morning, Nathan invited me to breakfast. It was a simple diner near the soccer field where Elliot played. Nothing fancy, no special occasion, just breakfast. Halfway through the meal, he reached for the check. Instinctively, I moved to stop him. The habit was automatic. Nathan smiled and gently pushed my hand away. "I have got it." The gesture lasted less than 5 seconds, yet it carried more meaning than some conversations lasting hours. On the drive home, I found myself thinking about Pauline. Years earlier, I believed protecting my family meant removing every obstacle from their path. Looking back, I realized I had often confused protection with control. Every problem I solved prevented someone else from learning how to solve it. Every burden I carried prevented someone else from learning how much weight they could handle. The realization was not entirely comfortable. Nathan had made mistakes, but so had I. Around the same time, Elliot's school held a family project exhibition. As we walked through the displays together, he proudly showed me a presentation about responsibility. One section listed important lessons he had learned during the year. I expected something about homework or teamwork. Instead, one sentence caught my attention. "Doing things yourself makes you stronger." I stared at those words for a long moment. Then I looked toward Nathan standing across the room. He had seen the sentence too. Our eyes met briefly. Neither of us said anything. We did not need to. Sometimes growth becomes visible in the people around you before you fully recognize it in yourself. By early summer, the tension that once defined our relationship had largely disappeared. Not because everything was perfect, because honesty had replaced dependency. We were finally learning how to be father and son again instead of provider and recipient. And as I watched Nathan build a life that truly belonged to him, I began to understand something important. Losing the house had never been the real consequence. The real consequence was being forced to become the man he should have been years earlier. By the time Christmas arrived the following year, my life looked very different than it had 12 months earlier. The strange thing was that almost none of the changes involved money. The house Nathan and Diane once lived in belonged to another family now. The mortgage payments were gone. The emergency credit card was gone. The endless financial obligations that had quietly connected our lives for years had disappeared. Yet somehow, I felt closer to my son than I had in a very long time. A few days before Christmas, Nathan called and invited me over for dinner. Not because he needed help with a bill, not because he wanted advice about money. Simply because he wanted me there. When I arrived, Elliot was the first person through the door. He nearly knocked me backward with the force of his hug. Sophie followed right behind him. Carrying a handmade Christmas card, she insisted I open immediately. The apartment was smaller than the old house, much smaller. The furniture did not match perfectly. The decorations were not expensive. But something about the place felt warmer, more honest. For the first time, I was looking at a life built by Nathan and Diane rather than a life partially financed by me. During dinner, we laughed more than we had in years. Real laughter, not the polite kinds used to avoid difficult conversations. At one point, Nathan raised his glass and looked around the table. "I want to thank Dad," he said. The room grew quiet. "Not for paying for things," he smiled slightly. "For finally stopping." Everyone laughed, even me. But beneath the humor sat something important: understanding. Nathan no longer viewed my decision as punishment. He saw it for what it truly was: a boundary, a necessary one. Later that evening, after the children disappeared to investigate their presence, I stepped onto the apartment balcony. Snow drifted softly through the air. A moment later, Nathan joined me. For several seconds, we stood there without speaking. Then he looked out at the city lights and quietly said, "Mom was right." I smiled. "About what?" He laughed. "Which thing?" "She was right about almost everything." That sounded exactly like something Pauline would have enjoyed hearing. Nathan grew serious again. "She used to say that love is not measured by what people give you. It is measured by what remains when the giving stops." I felt my throat tighten slightly, because after everything that had happened, we had finally discovered the answer. What remained was still family, not perfect family, not effortless family, real family, built on respect instead of dependence, built on honesty instead of obligation. As I stood there looking at the snow falling across the city, I thought about the Christmas message that started everything. At the time, it felt like a betrayal. Maybe it was. But sometimes the most painful moments in life force us to confront truths we have been avoiding for years. Nathan learned responsibility. I learned boundaries. And together we learned something Pauline understood all along. Love grows strongest when it is freely given, not financially supported. And for the first time in many years, Christmas finally felt like home. Thanks for watching, and remember, the craziest stories are still ahead. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one.